Welcome to another episode of the Battlefields Bourbon podcast, the podcast where we sit and sip, talk all things Civil War history and bourbon and whiskey. I'm Jack, joined as always by my co-host Elijah. Today we are coming to you from the historic Bell House in beautiful downtown Winchester, Virginia. The Bell House is preserved and maintained by the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation, managing entity of the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields National Historic District. If you'd like to support the podcast, consider becoming a member of the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. Every dollar you give to support battlefield preservation in turn helps support the Battlefields and Bourbon podcast. We've got an exciting episode today with an exciting guest, but before we get started, our glasses are empty, so tell us what we're sipping on today, Elijah.
So today we've got Castle & Key's single barrel expression of their bourbon. This one is 104.4 proof, so that's 52.2% alcohol by volume. The mash bill for this one from their website is showing 73% corn, 10% rye, and 17% malted barley. So the rye is the tertiary grain in this mash bill, which is interesting because some distilleries will do that, and you'll definitely notice a unique flavor profile there. But a little bit on Castle & Key. They are actually in the old Taylor distillery, what used to be E.H. Taylor's distillery after he left Buffalo Trace. So this is like they revitalized that distillery after it had closed down for a number of years, and now they're doing Castle & Key from the old Taylor distillery. So we can... Ooh, just drop the cork.
There we go.
But yeah, that distillery, I'm pretty sure, was closed down for a number of years, and then they only recently reopened it, I would say, within the past 10 or 15 years. So it had been kind of vacant for a little while there.
So is it owned by Sazerac?
No.
So they just sold the property and they bought it?
Yeah, I don't know that Sazerac ever owned this one at that point. I think it had closed before they had the chance to get their hands on it. But...
cool bottle.
Yeah, no, and it's like it got a nice like oaky leather kind of nose to it. It's interesting. It's not like anything I've ever smelled before.
For being a higher proof, I don't get too much heat off of it.
I think it's that malted barley coming through, being the secondary grain. It's got that sweetness.
Is there wheat?
No wheat in this one, which is surprising because it kind of tastes like there should be in it, but I think it's just that malted barley is giving it a little punch there. But it's really good. I enjoy that. I think that's a pretty unique flavor profile.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and shout out to Castle & Key for sending us that one, because that was they didn't have to do that. So the fact that they're supporting us in that way to make this episode possible, that's super cool of them, and we appreciate that for sure.
Yeah. Well, speaking of wheat not being in the bourbon, there was wheat growing on the fields of this battlefield 160 years ago. And to talk about the Battle of Cool Spring is a good friend of mine and author and editor of dozens of articles and books, director of the McCormick Civil War Institute at Shenandoah University, and Valley resident. Now, can I call you a native or no?
No, from Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Yep.
Schuylkill County, right?
County,
yep.
PA.
There you go. Yeah. Well, welcome to the podcast, Mr. Jonathan Noyalas.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. There would be no better person to talk about the Battle of Cool Spring than you, and I appreciate you coming on. Just about a week ago, a couple weeks ago, we commemorated the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Cool Spring, and with that, a newly released book to the Emerging Civil War series, The Blood-Tinted Waters of the Shenandoah. And I was excited when I talked to you about a year ago that you were coming out with this book. It was, the timing of it was just right with your involvement with the battlefield, the development of, a battlefield park in a way. And it's really cool that 106 years later, there's now a book that can guide people to the battlefield, interpret it in a way that's easy to digest, but then also gives a full picture before, during, and then after the battle itself. So with that being said, how do we get to the banks of the Shenandoah River in the late summer of 1864?
Yeah, so it really sets up, with what's happening around Petersburg in mid-June. So mid-June of 1864, once Robert E. Lee makes that decision to move to Petersburg, and Grant, of course, makes that decision after Cold Harbor, needs to break off. He's under an enormous amount of pressure from President Lincoln, because again, everything that happens in 1864 is happening with the 1864 election looming over it. And so when Grant makes that decision to move across the James, move south of Petersburg, and then try to take the Confederate capital from the south, Robert E. Lee is thinking, what can I do in order to create a diversion? And of course, for all of your listeners who are familiar with the Shenandoah Valley and its role during the Civil War, Shenandoah Valley offers a lot to the Confederate war effort. Aside from being a source of provender for troops operating in the Old Dominion, it's also a point from which to threaten Washington, a point from which you can threaten invasion of the North. And so Robert E. Lee, thinking back to the spring of 1862, what Stonewall Jackson did, and alleviating pressure on the Confederate capital, he decided to cut Jubal Early loose. And so Early, moves from Petersburg, drives General David Hunter from Lynchburg, moves north through the Shenandoah Valley, crosses over into Maryland, hits ransoms Hagerstown, engages federal forces under Lew Wallace at Monocacy on July 9th. 2 days later, he's at the gates of Washington on the northern boundary of the national capital. And it's really that presence of Jubal Early's force outside of Washington, D.C., with Fort Stevens being that major obstacle between him and his command. That's really what sets up Cool Spring. And so, one of the things that I do in the book, I spent a lot of time in the first chapter, talking about the mood and the sentiment of people in Washington, D.C., from civilians all the way up to President Abraham Lincoln. And one of the things that a lot of historians, there's not really been a lot of historians who have written about Cool Spring, but those who have and those who have mentioned it, and in particular writing about the operations in Northern Virginia, Maryland, and of course the outskirts of D.C. in the summer of 1864, they oftentimes use an exchange between Henry Kidd Douglas and Jubal Early on the night of July 12th. And that was, Early telling Kidd Douglas, we haven't taken Washington, but we've scared Abe Lincoln like hell. And I remember going into this book project, years ago, thinking, how scared really was Abraham Lincoln? And Lincoln, it becomes clear to me, and I write about this, and I think I make the argument in the book, that Lincoln felt a lot of emotions in that second week of July. Being scared like hell wasn't one of them. I think Lincoln was extremely aggravated that Jubal Early's men got to the northern boundary of Washington. But ultimately, what Lincoln felt was aggravation. He wanted an immediate resolution to this. He wanted Jubal Early destroyed and annihilated. So Early makes this decision, right, to not attack. And again, Early is a very stubborn, cantankerous commander. I think that's borne out in his operations in the Valley during the autumn of 1864. But Jubal Early was reasonable enough to know that there was no way on God's green earth that he would be able to take the capital and sustain any success. So he might have been able to punch through Fort Stevens, but the reality of the situation is he's not going to be able to hold on to it. And so he makes that decision to withdraw, and Lincoln very much wanted an immediate pursuit. But there was a problem. You had a conglomeration of forces responsible for the defense of Washington. There was not a singular commander. And even though Lincoln was commander-in-chief, Lincoln made a promise to Grant when he appointed Grant as general-in-chief in March of 1864. And the promise was that I will never, ever interfere in your command decisions unless you do something that is, just off the wall, or you really delay in making decisions. And I'm talking like McClellan-like delays here. And so Lincoln communicated with Grant. Grant, the following day appointed Horatio Wright as commander of this pursuit force. And then they leave Washington on July 13th around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and the pursuit begins. So if you think about this, Jubal Early's command, they have a really, a good start, a head start, not quite 24 hours, but long enough. And one of the things that I've oftentimes encountered people tell me out at Cool Spring when I've given tours out there, and for the listeners who don't know, I want to give a plug here if I can. So Shenandoah University was given 195 acres of the Cool Spring Battlefield back in 2013. It was preserved by the American Battlefield Trust. And it's really one of the major reasons that I was brought to Shenandoah to head up their Civil War Institute, was to interpret that site and tell the story of that battle. But when I've led tours out there, I've had people tell me, well, if I was in charge, so we have the armchair generals in the 21st century saying, if I was in charge, my army would have moved much more quickly. And I want to remind people that, whether it's Union soldiers or Confederate soldiers, these are human beings who are being impacted by incessant campaigning and also environmental factors. So if you think about the weather conditions in the summer of 1864, and I really spent a lot of time in the book talking about the environment's impact on how these armies operate and function. So it's not, people like to think that Civil War battles happen in these ideal weather conditions, and they forget. Summer of 1864, there's been a terrible drought in the Shenandoah Valley. Temperatures are, 100 plus with the heat index. It's an exhausting environment for these guys. And so that's why it takes, 4 days for Horatio Wright's pursuit force to get to Snicker's Gap. And then, of course, when they get to Snicker's Gap on the 17th, Horatio Wright thinks it's going to be very easy to drive the Confederates from the Shenandoah River, to drive them from CASTLEman's Ferry. But, after repeated efforts by Union cavalry commanded by Alfred Dufay and Colonel James Mulligan's infantry brigade on the 17th, then Wright really begins to rethink things the following day. And that really sets up, the major part of what we think of as the Battle of Cool Spring, the fighting that happened on July 18th, 1864.
So why, and this might be an obvious question, but when I'm thinking about it, why Snicker's Gap? Why the that gateway into the valley? Is that exactly where Early crosses back in? So they're just following in tune. And I guess to that, why does Early cross there and not somewhere else?
Yeah. So, it's the closest point. So, Early crosses the Potomac into Virginia, near Leesburg, Virginia. He wants to get his men into the valley as quick as possible. So Snicker's Gap, provides him that opportunity. And one of the things that Early was very keenly aware of is how exhausted his men were. And so, it's interesting to look at the range of reactions among Confederate soldiers in his army as to what the advance to Washington actually achieved. And I always remind people, whether it's, a Civil War battle or anything, people never have a singular monolithic reaction to anything. And so there are Confederates like Jubal Early who thought, yep, we scared Abe Lincoln like hell. There are Confederates who thought this was a pointless mission. All it did was exhaust us. There are Confederates who thought we should have taken Washington. We could have taken Washington. There are Confederates who thought, well, we could have taken it, but we wouldn't have been able to sustain it. But the one thing that all Confederate soldiers were in agreement about was that they were exhausted. And so Early is looking to get them back into the Shenandoah Valley. Snicker's Gap provides that most expedient route. And he really wants his men to have an opportunity to rest. People make a lot of all the miles that Jackson covered from, March of 1862 until early June. And it's just shy of 700. Early's men in a month cover more than 500 miles. So they are putting on way more miles on their feet than Jackson's men.
So with that being said, we've kind of set the stage. Who are our main characters to play in the battle here? Who do we have that's going to be directly involved for the Confederates and same for the Federals? Well,
aside from Early and Horatio Wright, for the Confederate side, during the fighting that happens on the 18th, you have, two real major players in Gabriel Wharton, who commands a division in Early's army, and Robert Rhodes. And Rhodes's command really is going to bear a significant portion of the fighting on the 18th. On the Union side, some of the major players, again, aside from Horatio Wright, who commands that pursuit force, which was about 30,000 men, George Crook, who is commanding troops in the field that are part of the Army of West Virginia. But the real big guy is Colonel Joseph Thoburn. Thoburn is the one who really is the combat commander that day for the Union forces. He is the one directing everything and trying to respond to the mess that he has been handed. And his men are really put into an unfair situation that day.
Yeah, so we know, is it on the 17th when Dufay's men kind of probe across CASTLEman's Ferry?
Yeah. So, on the 17th, Dufay launches numerous attacks against CASTLEman's Ferry. John B. Gordon's troops are there. All of those, attempted attacks are repulsed. And then what happens is the following day, early that morning, George Crook shows up. He's up there in Snicker's Gap. He sees troopers from the 22nd Pennsylvania Cavalry launching an assault against CASTLEman's Ferry, and the result is the same as everything that happened on the 17th. And it was at that moment in time that Crook decided, along with Horatio Wright, okay, we just can't keep doing the same thing and hope for a different result. And so we need to try something, we need to go to a plan B. And so the plan B was to take, approximately 5,000 troops under Colonel Thoburn's command, move them through pathways in the Blue Ridge Mountains, move them across property that's now owned by Shenandoah University, and then cross at Island Ford and flank the Confederate position.
So they decide, what is this, about a mile north of the
It's about a mile north of CASTLEman's Ferry. And this is really one of the cool stories that has been fleshed out in the book. Even going back a year to when, you kind of knew this book was coming out, there were still some questions I had about the person who leads Thoburn's men. So, in a lot of the early history, so going back to the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, when Cool Spring got a little bit of a mention, and I see you have the booklet that was done by the Catholic priest there on the table. The person who leads the Union soldiers, his name was John Carrigan. And, John Carrigan has such a fascinating story. He was born in New York City, 1818. He had moved with his family to Clark County, or what became Clark County, and he lived there for decades before the war as a tailor. He ended up in the spring of 1861, the day after Virginia's secession convention passed the Ordinance of Secession. He enlisted in the 2nd Virginia Infantry. He was in his mid-40s at this point. He enlisted as a musician. And then he ended up deserting March 11th, 1862, which is the day that Stonewall Jackson evacuated Winchester. And I always wondered, I thought, well, first of all, why did he do this? Where did he go? What did he do? And in some of the histories, it basically just made it appear like he deserted, went back to Clark County, happened to be there on the day of the Battle of Cool Spring, and was like, hey, I'll help you guys. That's not really what happens. So doing a lot of digging in primary source material, I found out that after he deserted, he went to Monrovia, Maryland, spent some time there, and then in January of 1864, ended up enlisting in the 3rd Maryland Potomac Home Brigade. So that 3rd Maryland was actually part of Horatio Wright's pursuit force that was coming out of Washington, D.C. So as that column is moving, he is making it known, hey, I'm from this area. I have knowledge of this area. If I can be of help, let me know. And so he ends up leading Thoburn's men, through those paths, coming down across the retreat, the property that's owned by the university, and getting them across at Island Ford. Carrigan has a really sad story to the end of his life. He moved back to Clark County after the Civil War. It seems that a lot of his friends seem to forgive him for changing allegiances, midstream. And there's all sorts of, potential reasons as to why he ultimately decided to do that. But he ended up killing himself. He committed suicide in 1888. And why exactly, we don't know. But my theory is that he got married after the war, had a child. Both his wife and child died during childbirth, and I think that was enough for him. And he just decided to end it all and kill himself. Wow.
So a sad ending to, how Thoburn's men get to the area known as the retreat. And can we go, before we kind of get into the battle action and what happens, and you've talked about the ownership that, Shenandoah now has over that property, but what's, pre-July 1864 leading right up to it, what is this property and what is its importance? Yeah,
so the retreat really is a fascinating historical property. So the 195 acres that the university owns was once part of an 1,100-acre plantation. During the time of the Civil War, it was owned by Judge Richard Parker. So this is the same Judge Parker who presided over John Brown's trial in the autumn of 1859, condemned John Brown to death for his, attempted insurrection at Harper's Ferry in October of 59. When the Battle of Cool Spring happens, Judge Parker's not there. So his primary residence is in Winchester. He inherited the property from his father when his father passed away in the 1840s. But what we were able to uncover is his overseer. So his overseer was there. His last name was Robinson. And he ultimately, doesn't write anything about the battle, But what he does do is he sends a note to Judge Parker back in Winchester after the fight is over, and he's like, the farm is destroyed. It's just totally damaged. But at that property, because it's a plantation, there are enslaved people who are living there. This is a property where after the enslaved people learn about, John Brown's raid, they are reacting in ways that are typical of enslaved people in the valley. They're killing livestock. They're burning outbuildings on the property. And we also think that there's a connection between this property and the Underground Railroad. So a number of years ago, my students and I at Shenandoah University were digging into the backgrounds of enslaved people and ultimately found a story of 3 enslaved people who came to our property, came to one of the slave cabins on the property to get a chicken, to get a boat, trying to make their way to freedom. They ended up drowning in Parker's Hole, which is a sort of really deep, dark abyss amid the Shenandoah's waters. And I always wondered, I thought, and I know we're getting off on a tangent, but I'm going to talk anyway. I wondered why these guys were coming here. And there is this old tradition of there being this large hollow sycamore tree somewhere on our property along the banks of the river. And ultimately, there is a large, significantly old sycamore tree on our property that's been bricked in that very well might have been this hideout on the Underground Railroad. The challenge, of course, is proving it, because Underground Railroad obviously doesn't keep records, and they're not going to hang a sign out that says this is the hiding tree. But again, it just adds another little piece to our story that we can tell out there.
Yeah. So this landscape, owned by Judge Richard Parker, it's about 1,000 acres at the time. Is this all on the east side of the Shenandoah River?
Yeah. So the 1,100 acres roughly. It was all on the east side, and also the 2 islands.
Okay.
So there are 2 islands if you visit the property, Parker's Island South and Parker's Island. During the time of the battle, those were owned and farmed by Judge Parker. Today, they're actually owned by the Abbey that sits on the western side of the Shenandoah. Yeah,
and you mentioned, just to kind of paint the picture, obviously the only way to understand, in my opinion, the battlefield itself and how the battlefield moves is by going there. And you have the opportunity to do that. It's probably, what would you say, 100 yards or less from the drop of the Blue Ridge Mountain to the Shenandoah River, of just river plain.
Yeah, maybe 150, 200 yards,
yeah.
But it's very, very close.
Short distance there, and you have this side road where the Federals are coming down, Thoburn's men running right next to the home known as the retreat.
Right.
And then that road leads directly to its Island Ford, correct?
Right.
And that'll run at the southern tip of Parker's Island South.
Correct.
And then that's where they can cross to go to the western side of the Shenandoah River. And all that land's protected too, correct? Under a conservation easement.
Right.
And so that kind of, and most of the landscape, prior to it being preserved, the battlefield now, the Cool Spring Battlefield, it was a golf course, always a battlefield, but it was a golf course at one point in time. Yeah. But most of the terrain itself has not been altered too much.
That's correct. Yeah. So the golf course goes back to the 1950s. And we had, it's probably been 7-8 years ago now, a cultural landscape study done on that property, funded through a grant from the National Park Service. And I was surprised. Now, I was curious because obviously you put a golf course in and there's, sand traps and all this kind of stuff. And I thought, well, how much really did the landscape change? And what that report revealed was that, the contours of the land really didn't change all that much.
Yeah, just some like minor feature changes,
Correct.
Like where the road goes to the ford. There's a pond there. So, but other than that, we've kind of set the stage for what the stage looks like. So what time of day is it roughly when Thoburn's men begin to cross at Island Ford?
So this crossing and this battle, and again, I think sometimes people have a conception in their head that everything happens in the morning. It's not the case. This is a late afternoon, evening, and night battle. So Thoburn, his men get to the Shenandoah River, around 3:30 that afternoon. It is a contested crossing. And so Thoburn is thinking, oh, this is going to be easy. We'll just move across, turn south, and flank the Confederates at CASTLEman's Ferry. But there's actually troops from 2 Virginia regiments sitting on that opposite shore. So the lead brigade in Thoburn's command, commanded by Colonel George Wells, they force the crossing. And again, there's only about 100 Confederates there. So if you're talking, Welles's brigade is about 1,000 men, so it's 10-1 numerical advantage. So it's pretty easy for them to drive off the Confederates. But what happens is during that skirmish that happens at Island Ford, Welles's men capture anywhere from like a dozen to 16 Confederates. Even Thoburn isn't clear in his reports how many, but the number really doesn't matter. What matters is the information that he receives from those prisoners of war. And what they tell him is that, not only do you have to worry about Gordon at CASTLEman's Ferry, but you have Gabriel Wharton is about a mile away, Robert Rhodes is about a mile away, Jubal Early, of course, is in Berryville, and Thoburn is starting to freak out because he has 5,000 troops. He's kind of running the numbers in his head. He knows there's at least 9 to 10,000 Confederates on the same side of the river as him. There's a river between him and the rest of the army. And so this is where he makes an appeal to General Crook, who then goes to Wright, saying, can I come back across now to the east side of the Shenandoah because I'm cut off? And this is where initially General Crook is like, nope, just stay there. Don't turn south. Just put your men in battle position, await further orders. But as Thoburn is doing that, putting his men in position, Crook can see out in the distance, and he can see Robert Rhodes' division approaching. He can see Gabriel Wharton's division approaching Island Ford. He starts freaking out, asks General Wright for permission to bring Thoburn across, to which Wright's response is, nope, don't worry about it. We're going to send additional support, and that support would come in the form of General James Ricketts' division of the 6th Corps. But as you know from having been out there touring the site with me, Ricketts does not do what Horatio Wright promised Ricketts would in fact do.
Yeah, so Ricketts. Well, let's talk about Thoburn. Once his 5,000 men are across the river, and they're now on the western side, they're cut off from the rest of the main army. Let's talk a little bit about the terrain on that side, just to paint that picture, but as well as what is Thoburn going to do with that terrain to his advantage.
So it's a sloping ground. So I think Cool Spring is a really unique battlefield because, again, I think people think of like Gettysburg and flat plains and, pieces of high ground. Thoburn is going to put his men essentially in two main lines. So there's going to be a line that's hugging, the western bank of the Shenandoah River. There's going to be a line about 75 yards up from that. And again, this is all very sloping ground. And then there'll be a line of skirmishers beyond that. So, Thoburn, when he puts his men in position, he doesn't really know from which direction the attack is going to come. But when you get to about, 5 o'clock, Gabriel Wharton launches the first assault. And as I tell people all the time when they come out to Cool Spring, Gabriel Wharton's attack is never meant to be the main attack. It's not the main attraction, it's the main distraction.
I was waiting for it.
That's
I
right.
love this. Yeah.
And so the real attraction is Robert Rhodes.
Yeah.
So what Wharton has to do is he has to buy enough of time so that Robert Rhodes can get into position, because what ultimately Early wants to have happen is to have Rhodes strike the northern end of Thoburn's position.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. Did you come up with that on your own?
I did.
That's
Trademark it.
amazing. You trademark. Put that on a T-shirt and sell it.
That's right.
Yeah, understanding that line that you just said, I think helps paint the full picture. You still have Gordon's men that are down at CASTLEman's Ferry. They're still an obvious threat.
Correct.
But they're about a mile away. Mm-hmm. You said that Wharton's men, it's almost a frontal attack to Thoburn's position. And Rhodes's men, are they coming from the Berryville Pike and then going up?
No, so they're cutting across country. So they actually were encamped near Wycliffe Church. Okay. So Wycliffe is about 1.4 miles from Island Ford.
Okay, so they're just coming straight, and they know to come in at the. And what's the timing of it once Wharton comes in to attack Thoburn? The timing of Rhodes'
it happens very, very quickly. So the first assault, Gabriel Wharton's around 5 o'clock. Robert Rhodes is probably hitting the northern end of Thoburn's line about 15 to 20 minutes later. Mm-hmm. So he doesn't have to buy that much time. But this all happens very, very quickly. And of course, once that attack does occur, then you have mass pandemonium on the northern end of the Union line. And so when Thoburn put his troops in position, the troops that were on that far right end was, if I was in charge, and again, you can kind of play, Monday morning quarterback here, I probably would not have put this unit in to protect a flank, because the troops that were on his northern flank was a newly organized unit of about 1,000 men commanded by Colonel Samuel Young. It was a body of dismounted cavalry. And so, again, I think sometimes people might not understand exactly what dismounted cavalry means. So I say that term, and if your listeners are familiar with Gettysburg, they're thinking John Buford's men on July 1st, and they're off their horse and they're shooting their carbines. That is not what I mean by dismounted cavalry at all. What I mean is that these guys, about 3 weeks before the battle, they didn't have their mounts. They were reorganized under Young's command, and they were forced to turn in their carbines, and muskets were replacing them. And I always thought, years ago when I first started studying, so this goes back more than a decade, started really studying Cool Spring, I made an assumption. So when Robert Rodes' flank attack hits the northern end of Thoburn's line, most accounts said Young's men fire maybe a volley or two, and then they retreat across the Shenandoah River. And I made the assumption, well, they're cowards, right? That's what we would think. These guys aren't really good fighters. And then you start to look at diaries and letters of soldiers from Young's command, and it becomes a little bit clearer about why they did what they did. And so one of the guys I write about in the book, Sergeant James Henry Avery, he wrote about how really embarrassed he was, the way that he and his comrades fought at Cool Spring, because these guys, again, they've only had their muskets for a couple of weeks. They haven't really been trained to fight as infantry, but they're being expected to fight as infantry. And so, Avery is one of those guys who, at the first sight of Confederates, Rhodes's men, he loads his musket, but he doesn't do what you're supposed to do when you load the musket. He takes his cartridge, and instead of separating the bullet from the powder, just rams the whole thing. And so this is not a combustible cartridge. It's not a Johnson & Dow. And so he goes to fire, and boom, nothing happens. And so then, fortunately for him, one of his buddies goes down. He picks up that musket, remembers what he's supposed to do, but then he leans his ramrod up against a tree, loses his ramrod. He's like, crap, I don't know what to do. There's no other musket to be had, and so he retreats. And so the point here I'm trying to make is these guys are retreating not because necessarily they're guilty of cowardice. It's an indication of their poor training. This is the first moment that these guys, it's like they're rookies.
Yeah.
They might have fought in cavalry units up until this point in the war, but they're being put into a new environment, a new situation. And when you're in a combat situation like that, you need to just, be able to not even think. You just need to be able to do. They're not accustomed to doing that. And so those 1,000 guys, the large majority of them, I'd say within 15 minutes after Rhodes's assault, they're back on the east side of the Shenandoah River.
When the reload time between, say, like a Sharps carbine or a Smith carbine and that of like a Springfield is drastically different. And like you were saying with a combustible cartridge, you just put a Sharps in the breech, close the lever, put your cap on, you're good.
Yeah.
But then your muskets, like you said, you have to rip the cartridge open and everything.
That's the whole process.
Yeah, so they probably thought as that reload time was a lot longer than it actually seemed, and they see all this massive Confederates coming towards them, and they're like, oh crap, we got to go.
Yeah. So this is our first kind of look at the Federal retreat, a portion of the Federal retreat during the battle. Are these troops retreating back across the same spot that they came across?
No, they're coming across at a different point. So again, they're about 3/4 of a mile to a mile north of where they crossed, and this creates problems. And so there's the first problem is these guys, as they're streaming across the Shenandoah River, are thinking, okay, when we crossed at Island Ford, the water wasn't really deep at all, maybe knee, mid-thigh at its highest point. But there are some guys who end up plunging into the depths of Parker's Hole. So Parker's Hole, you go out to Cool Spring today, you can see it. There is signage there, but you don't even need a sign because it's this part of the Shenandoah where the waters start to swirl. It's really this dark, deep green color, and it is, anywhere from like 15 to 25 feet in depth. And so if you're a soldier who's freaking out, thinking, I just want to get to the other side, you're not really paying attention to what's going on. You don't know that you have 20, 25 feet of water there, and you plunge to your watery grave. When Young's command were retreating, and some of these guys end up drowning in Parker's Hole, This was a site that really tormented and haunted guys in Young's command. So one of the accounts that I write about came from a surgeon. His name was James Noggle. And Surgeon Noggle said that he's a surgeon, he's a doctor, he wants to help people, but there's nothing he can do at that point. And, he wrote, and again, this is a guy who lives for decades after the battle, he's tormented frequently in nightmares by scenes of these guys, drowning in the river, gasping for breath, and there's nothing that he can do to help them. So again, Mother Nature intervenes, presents a problem. But one of the other issues as they're, retreating across the river to the east side that's owned by the university is that this is the point where Ricketts shows up. And so could you imagine if you're General Ricketts, you and your division have performed well up to this point, and you see, 20% of Thoburn's command basically is removing themselves from the battlefield, and you're told you have to go to the opposite side. And so Ricketts at this point was reluctant to cross, won't do it. So there's an argument that ensues between him and George Crook, where Crook is demanding Ricketts cross, and ultimately Ricketts says, "Look, this battle's lost. There's nothing that's going to be achieved if I cross." And so what ends up happening is Crook goes up to Snicker's Gap, asks Horatio Wright what's his take, and Wright says, "Yeah, even though I promised you that Ricketts is going to cross, I'm going to hold him over here." And so at this point in time, the objective for the Battle of Cool Spring, it changes. So it's no longer about defeating the Confederates. It's no longer about driving them from CASTLEman's Ferry. It's about survival at this stage. And so Thoburn is going to start to do things in order to help his command survive. And sometimes those things will work, and sometimes they won't work out all that well and actually just create some more chaos.
Wow. So as you've got portions of Thoburn's men retreating, does Thoburn have to make a decision to reorganize his line, keep up the fight? There's no order to retreat as one mass yet.
No.
So what's his take?
So what happens is once Young's command is taken out of action, and once it becomes clear to Thoburn that the ultimate objective is, Rhodes attacking that northern end of the line, he begins shuffling troops from that far southern end to the right end, and he also begins to realign troops. So one of the first things he does is he takes Colonel Daniel Frost's brigade, and he'll wheel them from facing west so that they face north to present a front to Rhodes' division. But in the course of that movement, what ends up happening is Frost is mortally wounded. He's shot through the bowels. When he goes down, there's chaos that ensues in his brigade, and a lot of guys from his brigade, they retreat across the Shenandoah River. So now, again, this is all happening very, very quickly. Within an hour of the battle opening up, Young's command is out, Frost's brigade is out. And so the only thing Thoburn can do is he has to make a decision. Do I stay and fight, or do we retreat? And the commanders who remain said, it's probably in our best interest to stay and fight and retreat under the cover of darkness. And so he starts, shuffling troops. One of those regiments he sends up to the far north end is the 116th Ohio, commanded by Colonel James Washburn. Just at the point Washburn gets to that northern end of the line, Confederate bullet pierces his right eye, exits out the backside of his left head, outside the left of his head. And ultimately, his men think he's a goner. I mean, the regimental historian, Thomas Wilds, writes about this. His veterans write about how sad they were. Guys are weeping. But again, they have to pay attention to the Confederates who are attacking them. Remarkably, Washburn survived. But I always like to use Washburn's story to remind people of the importance of a battle isn't always tied to the size of a battle. And so, Cool Spring, I'm not naive. It is not a huge battle. It does not rank among, the likes of Shiloh, Antietam, the Wilderness, Gettysburg, whatever the case is. But one of the goals of the book is to remind people that for a soldier wounded, like Washburn is, for a wife who loses a husband, for kids who lose a parent, a father, that's the biggest moment of the war for them. They could care less about political outcomes and strategy and all that kind of stuff. And so, I doubt that there was a day that passed in Washburn's life. He died in the late 1890s. There was not a day that passed that he didn't think about Cool Spring. Yeah. Because he looked in the mirror, he had that disfigured face staring back at him. He had incessant pain from that injury. And he was always thinking about that, because that was a life-altering moment for him.
Yeah, I think that's something that's always stuck with me since I've been on tours with you and I've watched lectures and things like that and me growing up, expanding my knowledge of history was this idea that, there are big battles out there, but those are just numbers. These are massive battles for everybody involved, whether you just fought in it or you were wounded or you had a friend that was killed right next to you. This was the biggest moment of the war for them, and that's always stuck with me. So we didn't hit on it, but maybe this is now as it's getting darker outside during the battle. What role does artillery play in this battle for both sides?
Yeah. So it's really it's remarkable. So when you look at Confederate accounts of this battle, and I'm talking guys in Rhodes's command. So if you think about Rhodes' division, where they have been up to this point in the war, the battles they have fought in, there are a fair amount of veterans in Rhodes's command who regard the fighting at Cool Spring as one of the most fiercest engagements in which they've ever been involved. What makes it so fierce is not just the tenacity of Thoburn's men, who are remaining and fighting, until the cover of darkness, but also Union artillery. So Colonel Charles Tompkins, who is the artillery chief for the 6th Corps, he is going to send 2 batteries, Battery C and G, 1st Rhode Island Light Artillery. They'll have an additional battery from Crook's Army of West Virginia, Battery E, 1st West Virginia, that are going to sit up there in the bluffs, and they are going to direct well-aimed shots from their Parrott rifles and ordnance rifles at the Confederates, making life very, very difficult for Rhodes's command. So, you think about why this doesn't turn into a disaster. Why is Thoburn not annihilated? There are a couple of reasons. Artillery is one of them. Tenacity is another reason. But a third reason is the terrain. So, there is a stone wall during the Battle of Cool Spring that actually lines the western edge of the Shenandoah River, and that road it's depressed below that stone wall. So there's a lot of cover for Thoburn's men, so they can rise up, fire, get down and cover. That coupled with the artillery, it makes life very difficult for Rhodes's men. And so, Rhodes is going to launch, multiple assaults that evening, that night against that position, is not going to be able to crack that position.
And I think, too, with the Confederate artillery and their position on the bluffs, further back by the Cool Spring Plantation, the line of sight that you have is obscured by that kind of ridge line that cuts through the middle of those open fields, and then you've got the road depression below that, and it's not easy to get an artillery shot that's shooting pretty straight down at that angle over that bluff.
Right, and so what
position.
You're 100% correct. So what the Confederate artillery is trying to then do is to shoot the Union artillery in the bluffs. But the problem is the shells are landing way short, which is good for the Union artillery, but bad for Ricketts' division. And so this is also one of those things, right? So Ricketts' men aren't engaged, but they're still taking casualties because they're sitting on that property on the east side of the river, and errant Confederate artillery shells are landing, and there are guys being killed in Ricketts' division just standing there.
Wow. And this is on property owned by the university.
Correct.
So that's so as we transition into the night, you have Rhodes attempting attack on Thoburn's refixed line. Is it kind of like an L-shaped line with the, he's got one side facing west, one side facing north. Is there a side facing south?
No. So basically, what happens once Frost's brigade, which would have created an L, once his brigade pulls out, it's just a straight line behind the cover of that stone wall. And then, of course, once darkness sets in, and again, daylight savings time doesn't happen yet, so we're looking, 8:15, 8:30. He starts pulling his men back across to the east side of the river, and this is where you kind of begin another battle.
Yeah.
Kind of the second battle of Cool Spring that veterans are going to fight until their death. And so there's this really awkward moment when Thoburn's men get to the other side of the Shenandoah River. I've already said, Ricketts' men are here, and Thoburn's men are like, why didn't you come over and help us? And the rank and file said we wanted to, but our commander wouldn't allow us to do so. And so, people's imaginations, when you have the absence of clear information, people's imaginations kick in. And so people started to imagine, okay, why was it? And so one of the rumors that was very wildly circulating through Thoburn's command was that Horatio Wright did this on purpose, that he didn't like George Crook and wanted to do something to discredit George Crook. I don't know that there's any merit to that, but again, perception's reality. That's what these guys are believing. I will say, if you look at Sheridan's operations in the Valley, Crook and Wright did not get along at all. And so, that could certainly fuel the fires in the post-war fight. And so these guys are looking for answers. They want to know, why did we sacrifice? Why are our buddies now killed or mortally wounded or, carrying Confederate lead in them? Was this all in vain? Was this all for naught? And so, of all the battles that Thoburn's men fought in, I think that this is one that really stuck with them because they never had closure as to what had happened. I mean, his guys, play such an important role at Fisher's Hill, at 3rd Winchester. Of course, they're the victimized. They're victimized in that surprise attack at Cedar Creek. But this is that battle where they really don't have any closure. They can't have a really good explanation as to why did this happen to us when there are 25,000 troops on the other side of the Shenandoah. They're not coming to our aid.
That thought crossed my mind earlier in the episode where, Ricketts arrives and they don't send him across. And Thoburn at that point has no clue why he's not coming to their aid. Yeah. There's got to be some sort of animosity there just because it's like you've left us high and dry over here and nobody's coming to help. It feels like a personal thing.
And it very well could be. The official response from both Ricketts and Wright is nothing would be achieved. It would just achieve more casualties.
Which is fair.
But Ricketts is taking casualties anyway from Confederate artillery.
Yeah. So and back to that same point we made about Young's men, as Thoburn's retreating into the night, as they're crossing back over, do we have some of these same experiences with Parker's Hole? With now it's pitch black outside, and they're trying to cross, and you've got wounded men on both sides. What is that experience like for Thoburn's men? Yeah,
that night is very, very difficult. So once Thoburn's men are all across, there are 2 regiments sent to picket the Shenandoah: the 2nd Rhode Island and the 37th Massachusetts. Both of those units are armed with Spencer rifles. And so what ends up happening is their job is to make certain that the Confederates don't try to cross, because again, they don't know what the Confederate intent is. And so what ends up happening is their goal is to, number 1, make sure no Confederates get across, and then number 2, help wounded Union soldiers get across the Shenandoah River. And so that night, it's almost a full moon. It's a clear night. And so visibility is pretty good. There are actually accounts of soldiers from the 2nd Rhode Island and 37th Massachusetts going up into treetops and looking out in the distance, and if they see anyone moving that they think is a Confederate, they're going to shoot. And then, of course, they're also helping to direct, hey, here's a wounded guy, bring him across. The efforts to save the wounded and bring them across, this was really an inspiring moment, so much so that in the 1880s, a woman from Ohio named was Edith Thomas, wrote a poem. And it was, the title of the poem was A Christopher of the Shenandoah. And so a Christopher was actually referring to Christ. And it is this very powerful poem that discusses the efforts of soldiers evacuating their comrades. This idea, don't leave any man behind. And it's kind of sad to me, not just the words of the poem, but it's kind of sad that for many, many years after it was published, it became a mainstay at like Memorial Day programs across the country. I mean, there's accounts of newspapers in California reciting this poem, and then for whatever reason, it just sort of faded into oblivion and became forgotten for many, many years. And so that night, as guys in Thoburn's division are trying to figure out what happened. There's a different sort of battle going on there for those wounded. Confederates are going around that night, tending to their wounded as well. And again, I think this is sort of a sobering moment for soldiers on both sides. So I want to just share the story of Lieutenant Billy Bevins of the 43rd North Carolina. This is a guy who's in his early 20s. He's pretty significantly wounded in the leg, ends up having that leg amputated. He's brought to a hospital, York Hospital in Winchester, ends up dying about a week and a half after the battle. But when one of his really good friends, actually it turns out to be his cousin, Captain Cary Whitaker, finds him on the field, he's actually envious of his wound. And there are others in that regiment who are envious of the wound because they know he's going to get to go home. Like he's going to lose a leg, but he's going to get to home. Ultimately, he doesn't go home. He dies, and he's buried here in the Stonewall Confederate Cemetery in Winchester. So, in the aftermath of battle, there are these sobering moments, where you've seen your friend, someone you grew up with in the case of Billy Bevins, and you start to think, what is it all for? And you start to see that erosion of loyalty, of patriotism, ultimately.
Yeah, and one of those stories, very similar to that one, that struck me when I was on your last tour was the story of Samuel and James Smith.
Yeah.
Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so these are two brothers from the 18th Connecticut, both of whom were captured at 2nd Winchester and then later paroled. But during, one of those Union retreats, this was actually during the retreat of Frost Brigade, James Smith sees his brother Samuel go down, get shot in the back, and he's thinking as the Shenandoah's current is carrying him northward, do I try to save my brother and risk dying myself and leaving my wife, and children without the father and the husband, or do I try to save him? And ultimately he decides to let his brother go. His brother ends up drowning. And again, I can't imagine making that decision. I have a brother, and we might have fights once in a while, but I wouldn't want to see it end like that. And so, he again was tormented by this. He came back after the war was over, about 2 weeks after Lee surrendered in Appomattox, and was able to find his brother's remains. His brother had actually been pulled out of the river by a farmer several miles north of the battlefield, buried on that farm, and ultimately James took him back to the family farm in East Killingly, Connecticut.
Yeah, and we'll try to... Do you own that picture? Who owns that picture?
So that picture is owned by the family.
Okay.
And so Mike Smith, a great friend of Cool Spring, he, let us use that. He has since passed away. But, I keep in close contact with his descendants who are largely living in Buffalo, New York now.
Oh, go Bills.
Go Bills, right? Any chance to talk about the Bills.
There you go. Yeah, that image has always... Well, now connecting that picture in those names... I think it's on your website, and it's actually the image for the Through Their Eyes app.
Correct.
Which we can talk about it here in a little bit. But so rough, basically the battle's over by the time Thoburn's men comes back. What's the immediate aftermath, as well as kind of tying up the role that Cool Spring plays in this segment of the 64 Valley campaigns?
Yeah. So, the day after, July 19th, there's some, minor desultory firing that happens, nothing of any significance. What ends up happening is the following day, late 19th, early on the 20th, Jubal Early finds out that there's another Union force, General William Averell, moving from Martinsburg south to Winchester. And so not wanting to get stuck in the middle, Jubal Early pulls out. He moves his command to Winchester and then south towards Strasburg and Fisher's Hill. After Early withdraws, now Horatio Wright crosses his entire force to the western side of the Shenandoah River. And this is, again, kind of a sobering moment for his troops, because there are guys who see their comrades, and when the Confederates buried the dead, they buried their dead well. But they didn't bury the Union dead all that well, which is not unusual in the aftermath of a battle. And so it's this weird scene of, arms and heads and hands and legs sticking out of the ground. Soldiers who weren't buried were stripped naked and abused in some way by Confederate soldiers, which again is not unique to the aftermath of the Battle of Cool Spring or unique to Confederates. And so, there are accounts of Union soldiers seeing their buddies in this state, and they now say, I have another motivation to fight. It's revenge. And so while you have that going on, Horatio Wright sends another part of his force west toward Berryville just to see where Jubal Early's at. He doesn't see him, and he makes the assumption that since Jubal Early has left, he is leaving the valley, that he's going back to Petersburg to help Robert E. Lee. That's not ultimately what ends up happening. And so... Horatio Wright, I've always believed he never wanted to be in the valley in the first place, always wanted to be at Petersburg, because that's where he and his command would receive much more attention from the press. So Horatio Wright, declares Early is done, but ultimately, events that are going to happen in the next couple of days, July 24th, Second Battle of Kernstown, a great Confederate victory, and then 6 days later, John McCausland rides north to Chambersburg and burns Chambersburg to the ground. That was all an indicator that Horatio Wright got it wrong, that he was not, that Jubal Early was in fact not retreating from the valley. And this is kind of where the book ends with this story, because we try to assess what does all of this mean. And I think Assistant Secretary of War Charles Dana summed it up quite succinctly and well. He said, Wright's pursuit out of Washington achieved nothing. And so, from a strategic standpoint, from a political standpoint, Early was as much a threat at the end of July as he was in the middle part of the month. But again, from the perspective of a soldier who fought there, they don't want to believe that the sacrifice, the torment they went through was for nothing. And you see this on both sides, particularly with soldiers who either suffered a wound or lost a friend. John Alexander Steichleather, who was the color bearer of the 4th North Carolina, two of his best friends, Martin Snow and Sidney Bustle, were killed. And Steichleather knew that since he was the color bearer of the 4th North Carolina, that he was the actual target. This torments him. I mean, he lives well into the early 1900s, and he writes about this, incessantly after the war, about how he knows those bullets were intended for him, but were taken by his friends. And he said, for this reason, he said, this is why this battle, as he wrote, and I'm quoting now, should never be forgotten. Because it's not always about the big picture stuff. It's about how it impacts people individually. And Jack, you've heard me say this many a time before, but my graduate training at Virginia Tech was under the supervision of Bud Robertson. And Bud Robertson was always reminding us during our time in Blacksburg, history, not just Civil War, history is about people. Mm-hmm. And you can never, ever lose sight of that at all. Yeah,
and I think Cool Spring, it's just, whether it's supernatural or, divine intervention, for you having that mindset from your previous education, coming to Shenandoah and having Cool Spring kind of on the table, being such a small in numbers engagement gave you an opportunity as an educator with students to dive deeper into the stories of the people involved. Numbers wise, this isn't massive, but in less than a 10-year span, you've been able, with the help of your students, to uncover the stories of a lot of these soldiers on both sides that were directly affected by the battle itself.
Yeah, and you're right. So it's a manageable battle. So 13,000 troops engaged, about 1,000 casualties total, 165 dead. We were able to research the backgrounds of all those guys.
Yeah.
And so that's how you gain an intimate portrait of a battle's impact.
Yeah, I think, and you all have done a great job there. So with Cool Spring, folks can visit the eastern portion of the battlefield, the 195 acres.
Yep.
There's the walking trails, there's interpretive signage, there's the app that we mentioned. Can you talk a little bit about the app?
Yeah, so the app, which you star in, this is an augmented reality app. People can download it for free on any sort of smart device, iPad, smartphone, whatever. It's called Through Their Eyes. And so this is an augmented reality app that brings you into a moment in the battle. And so we basically chose, again, thinking about the human experience, we chose a dozen accounts, Union and Confederate, where individuals, we researched the background of that individual. So it could be Corporal Charles Lynch of the 18th Connecticut for whatever. And so when you download the app, you bring it up, and you scan a flat surface, so a table, a floor, whatever, and what will pop up is a map of the battlefield. And on this map, you will see flags that are connected to the location of a particular unit in the battle. You click on the flag, and this is a 360 experience. It's best on an iPad, but it brings you into a moment in the battle where you have biographical sketch of the guy before the battle, that soldier's account of that moment, and then a sketch of what happened to that person after the battle. But recreated in a 360 environment is the scene playing out before your eyes that this guy is describing. And so, Jack, you were there both days. We did Union and Confederate. And these things are not long. They're maybe 90 seconds, 100 seconds. But again, it's all aimed at bringing you into a moment and making that connection, reminding people that Civil War history is much more than a blue block or a red block on a map. It is about people of human beings of flesh and blood with hopes and dreams and potential and families that have had their experiences forever altered by what happened on that battlefield.
Yeah, and for folks that can download the app. You can come in person. The Institute holds, programs throughout the year. You always host a commemoration in July that's following or pre-Saturday. It's
the Saturday closest to July 18th.
Yeah. There's always a commemoration day there. And then every year for the past couple of years, every Saturday, the lodge at the battlefield has been open for visitors, and there's interpretation in there. Yeah. There's artifacts on display, and there's a handy dandy. I guess it's not volunteers anymore. We actually have
a paid people now.
Yeah, this is big steps with the Institute. Right. The Institute also has the Spirit of Freedom, Preserving Emancipation's Legacy in the Shenandoah Valley. That's a usable resource online, which you can get through the Institute's website. It's actually a great resource for any and all research regarding emancipation here in the Shenandoah Valley. And is there anything else you'd like folks to know about the Institute? I know you have your conferences in the spring and the fall.
Yeah, we do events all throughout the course of the year. Our big things are, we have a fall seminar and tour that always focuses on some aspect of the Valley. We have our spring conference, which we have set for, I don't want to give the date. I think it's the last Saturday in April. It's a Saturday after Easter. And it's going to be centered around the theme of fighting, writing, and refighting the Civil War. So joining me on the faculty this year will be Angela Riato, who's a historian for the Army, Dana Schoaf, who is at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, and Chris Mikowski.
There you
will
go.
Be on the faculty
lineup
this
there.
Year.
Yeah. Can you? I don't want to give it away, and you don't have to say it if you want to. I think you've said it. What's the topic for this fall? Unless it's already booked up.
For the fall, it's actually sold out.
Okay. Well, tell people
but
what.
But we have a waiting list, right? Because stuff happens and people have to cancel sometimes. So it is going to be the second Saturday in November, and it's focusing on the Third Battle of Winchester, but it's a unique tour that looks at Union soldiers remembering and refighting the Third Battle. So it's not your typical battlefield tour where you're going to follow the movements of armies. We're going to look at the decisions that were made, moments in the battle, and how Union veterans fought about these things. So, there are Union soldiers coming through the Berryville Canyon and the traffic jam that happens. How cavalry aren't remembered for their role. And so we're really going to be looking at it. Actually, in a way, kind of sets up our spring conference, looking at how these guys are refighting the Civil War, and also what those Union veterans coming back to the Valley beginning in 1883 and all the way into the early part of the 20th century, how they're refighting it here, what they're saying at monument dedications, and also their interactions with Confederate veterans. Because when these Union veterans come back, Confederate veterans are largely serving as their guide. So it's going to use the Third Winchester battlefield in a maybe a little bit of a non-traditional way.
Yeah, and you'll also be talking, shameless plug for the podcast, at the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation's 160th commemoration conference here in Winchester. You'll be speaking in the afternoon about Fisher's Hill and the battle and its legacy. So a little bit of the battle itself, which is about 15 minutes of actual history there, a 15-minute battle roughly, and then the legacy with that battle, which is very, very interesting. So come on out to that. And then we forgot to mention with the Institute, the journal.
So we do a lot. So there are bound to be things that I forget. So every year we publish a journal, Journal of the Shenandoah Valley during the Civil War era. It's the only academic publication that the university publishes. The journal that we have coming out, so this will be volume 8, comes out at the end of this year. We actually have some pretty interesting things in there. Robert Tanner, the guy who wrote Stonewall in the Valley, has an essay in there.
Wow!
And I'm going to keep you in suspense as to what the topic is.
Coming back out from the shadows.
So he has a book that came out, University of Tennessee Press, their Critical Decisions series, and so he has an essay in there. We have some other interesting things that are going to be in there as well. In terms of published primary sources, but we do a lot throughout the year. We've partnered with the Fort Collier Civil War Center to provide interpretive educational programming for them. So we'll actually have on the 21st, that Saturday of September, doing some programs out there. I know the Battlefields Foundation has stuff going on at Third Winchester as well that weekend in Fisher's Hill on that Sunday. So there's always a lot of stuff happening in the Valley.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for coming on. I'm excited that, this could be a topic that our listeners get to, push aside the large name battles and actually hone in on a topic like Cool Spring, and nobody better to talk about it than you. So thank you so much for
thanks
coming
for having
on.
me.
Thank
Yeah.
you.